Hello, everyone. Welcome to Refugee Welcome Collective Lunch and Dinner series. In these sessions, we aim to bring you interesting and timely information. Whether you are a volunteer, community sponsor, resettlement agency staff, a local advocate, or just someone who's interested in learning more, we hope that you enjoy today's session, setting boundaries and preventing burnout in community sponsorship. And that would also apply for volunteers too. Refugee Welcome Collective collaborates with partners to provide in-depth training programs, weekly training sessions, resources, and on-demand technical assistance for sponsors, resettlement agency staff, refugees paired with sponsors, community and institutional partners, and others to support quality community sponsorship programs across the United States. Just as a reminder for everyone who is joining us today, everyone who's joining us is automatically muted. However, if you have any question or if you want to make any comments during the webinar, please feel free to do so through the chat. And toward the end, we are going to have a Q&A time where you're going to have time to ask your questions. Think through your questions as Hannah's, presenting, and just, if you want to just even write them in the chat, she's going to be able to see them. And a reminder that at the end of the webinar today, by tomorrow, I will be sending out a recording of the webinar to everyone who attended today's webinar. And that would take us to our presenter for today, Hannah Scully, who is the Program Officer for Community Sponsorship with International Rescue Committee. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Joy, and hello, everyone. Happy Monday. Thank you so much for being here. So like Joy said, my name is Hannah Scully. I'm the Program Officer for Community Sponsorship at the International Rescue Committee. I started at IRC about 2 years ago when I joined our Charlottesville office to launch and oversee community sponsorship programs in response to the Afghan evacuation and the large influx of Afghan newcomers. So in that role, I really was, and in this current role, I've been able to really witness the power of community and the power of community sponsorship. But I have definitely also seen sponsors become burnt out due to a lack of boundaries and other reasons. This work is really hard, right? So you're faced with a lot of systemic problems that you don't always have control over. So in order to do this work sustainably, we must really be able to set boundaries and take a step back from it and protect ourselves. So that's what we'll be talking about today, and I'm really excited to be here with you all. Go to the next slide. Perfect, thank you so much. So just want to give a quick introduction to the IRC for those of you who are not familiar with it. We began as the International Relief Association in 1933 at the request of Albert Einstein, along with 51 other intellectuals and political leaders. And this organization eventually evolved into the present-day International Rescue Committee. And the International Rescue Committee, also known as IRC, our mission is to help people whose lives and livelihoods are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and regain control of their lives. Go to the next one. Perfect. So we work internationally in over 40 countries. An international program is actually the larger scope of our work, wherever there's a need due to conflict or disaster, and operations vary by country. But on the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about our US operations. So in the US domestically, which we'll be focusing on today, we're one of 10 national resettlement agencies that are contracted through the State Department's Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration to administer the reception and placement program and provide welcoming services for refugees admitted to the US. So focusing on today, we operate in 28 offices across 18 states, and programs vary by office size and capacity. But I just wanted to start with that to give you all an idea of who the IRC is to kick us off. For our program today, we'll be talking about our objectives are to understand volunteer burnout and learn how to prevent it, define what boundaries are and learn their importance, and gain tools to utilize in setting and keeping boundaries. I know, as Joy mentioned, there'll be time at the end for questions, and but like she said, if you do have any throughout the presentation, feel free to pop them in the chat, and I'll hopefully be able to address them. So I want to start with just a question for you all, or just to get everyone thinking about self-care. So I want to know from you all, like, how do you engage in self-care? When you're having a bad day, you're stressed, what do you do to unwind, relax? I want to get us all in that mindset. Yeah, so Barbara says spend time in nature. You can feel free to put it in the chat if you have any thoughts. How do you engage in self-care? Nature walks, yoga, unwinding with friends and family, pickleball, yes, all of it, all of this. Put on comfortable clothes, light a candle, meditate. Okay, everyone, the self-care pros, exactly. Clearing my schedule, that is a golden one. Self-care is just giving yourself some time sometimes. Yeah, absolutely. These are all great. I totally agree. I'm glad we've all got our methods of self-care ready to go. So I just wanted to start with that because to talk a little bit about burnout and stress. So we'll come back to the self-care, but anyone who has engaged in this work can tell you that supporting newcomers is not an easy task. It's incredibly meaningful and it's important, and there are a million positive aspects of it. But I think we can also agree that it can often increase your stress level and even take a toll on your health, which can lead service providers or co sponsors or volunteers to become burnt out. You are using your personal time and your personal resources to help newcomers in what can be one of the most intense and difficult times of their lives, like readjusting here. And you're working with them to find solutions to some really overwhelming situations and problems. And you're spending a great deal of time empathizing with what clients or the newcomers are going through. Sometimes when these workloads become too heavy and you're not prioritizing your self-care, you're going to become at risk of compassion fatigue and becoming burnt out. And burnout is defined by the World Health Organization as a syndrome with three key dimensions. The first is an overwhelming exhaustion, feelings of cynicism, and detachment from the job. Um, this can lead to a sense of ineffectiveness and lack of accomplishment, right? So, this feeling of burnout can also include a sense of hopelessness about the possibility to make change for an individual or for a whole group of communities. Burnout is very, very, very common. It's I think most people who engage in this work have felt it or know someone who's felt it. But and the symptoms of burnout can look different for each person, but the defining features includes a loss of interest in your work, an inability to focus, or a lack of interest and exhaustion. And I also want to note that burnout is not the same as feeling overworked, but being overworked can contribute to burnout. So on the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about how do we manage this? All right. So we know what burnout is. We know what it feels like to feel burnt out, but what do we do in this situation? So the first is connect with others. So typically community sponsors, as nature of the program, you're part of a group. So have you connected with other members of your group to see how they're feeling? Are they feeling burnt out too? What can you as a collective group do to take care of each other and help each other to take a step back from it and see the bigger picture and really see, you know, what is making you feel burnt out, kind of pinpointing those root causes and seeing what can you do as a group to fix that. Or sometimes it can be better to connect with someone who is not engaged in the work and can give you their objective opinions on it, as someone who does not have a relationship with the newcomer and can and maybe give you um, a perspective as someone, a third party objective who can give you some clarity into the situation. Or maybe your group is partnered with a resettlement agency through co-sponsorship. So if you are working with a resettlement agency, I highly encourage you to reach out to your point of contact at the resettlement agency. These are professionals who have absolutely dealt with stress and burnout and will likely be able to share some strategies for managing this with you. They can help you take a look at your relationship with a newcomer and the challenges that you're both facing and ID some areas where maybe you can take a step back or some areas where you should continue to support or help you with setting or maintaining your boundaries or facilitating that conversation with the newcomers. Second way to manage stress is that self-care, right? So we've just given some really good ideas of self-care activities. So pickleball, unwinding, clearing the calendar, all of these things. It might seem cliche and simple, but self-care, take care of yourself. Take some time to breathe, exercise, try counseling. If you feel like this work is consuming you and you're becoming burnt out or stressed, it's essential that you take a step back from it and take care of yourself. And then the third, the biggest, most proactive thing you can do to avoid becoming stressed or burnt out in the first place is setting boundaries and clarifying your role with the newcomer that you're working with. Setting boundaries may feel like you're putting up walls between your group and the client, but the reality is that good boundaries, they build walls to create sturdy foundations for a healthy relationship. Good boundaries ensure that the client is becoming self-sufficient instead of dependent and prevent you from becoming burnt out. So we'll take the next few slides to talk about burnout or boundaries, excuse me. So what are boundaries? Boundaries can be is a term that can be applied to numerous situations in our lives, so not just in this work. But to frame our discussion today, we're going to define boundaries as clear limits that allow for safe and professional connections between service providers and clients. Because newcomers can have seemingly overwhelming needs, an important aspect of this work is in understanding and communicating the limits and responsibilities of your role. So it's very essential to set up these boundaries and maintain them if you are hoping to serve individuals effectively, help them become self-sufficient. And we can go to the next slide. And so when thinking about boundaries in this relationship and the relationship between you and the newcomer, it's very, very important to remember that there is an inherent power differential between yourself and the newcomers that you're supporting. And you must always work to ensure that there is mutual respect and agency between both parties. The people who are in the agent group of the power dynamic are those who have been privileged by birth or acquisition, who knowingly or unknowingly exploit or have unfair advantage over members of the target groups. Conversely, those who are in the target groups, in this case, it's the newcomer family, are people who have been systematically discriminated against, marginalized, exploited by an oppressor's system of institutions. So again, I want to really highlight that this is not something that you are necessarily actively doing or imposing, but it just is there by matter of fact and the circumstance. So it's important to think about this framework and remember it, and thinking that as we, as agents, are making sure to use our power responsibly. So when looking at boundaries and thinking about boundaries, it's kind of an abstract term, right? So it's helpful to think of it as a picture. So in the middle, we have this helpfulness zone, the zone of helpfulness. And this is where we're going to be most helpful to our clients. And boundaries keep us from becoming over or under involved. There's no definitive lines between the zone of helpfulness and being under or over involved. And there is a short period of time in which we can still be helpful while we are under or over involved, as you can see with this overlap in the areas there. But there's a much larger period of time in which being over or under involved is not helpful at all to ourselves or to our clients or the newcomers we're supporting. So having boundaries, setting that keeps us in that zone of helpfulness. So I want to pause here and see from you all, what might it look like to be over involved with a client? I'd be curious to see what your thoughts are for that in the chat. What does it look like to be over involved with a client or a newcomer? Any thoughts on that? Over involved boundaries, what can that look like? It's okay if you're not sure. Doing everything for the newcomer rather than helping them learn to do it themselves. Exactly right. Handling all conversations with the client's landlord, 100%. So those two things seem really similar to me, just doing for rather than teaching how to do. They're two really good examples. Yeah. So it's kind of hard to judge in a resettlement space where clients have so many needs. But yeah, examples of being over involved or doing everything for them, talking to the landlord rather than empowering the client to talk to the landlord themselves. Maybe feeling a need to accompany the clients everywhere they go, like at doctor's appointments, Someone in the chat just said, making appointments for people, calling the school, handling all of the nuances of the kids' schooling. Exactly right. Doing these things for them rather than teaching them, this is how you call the school, or this is how you do these things. It's doing for rather than teaching how to do. Exactly right. So on the flip side, there's under-involvement. So what could that look like, right? So maybe avoiding phone calls from a client, or giving every client the same solution, being just under-involved. So there is the other side of that too. But I know for this purposes, we'll focus on the over-involved. And we can go to the next slide again. So I want to talk about the risks that happen when we don't have clear boundaries with our clients. There are risks for ourselves and for our clients on both sides, including risks to our safety and the safety of our clients. When we're under-involved, there's a risk that clients will have high expectations of how we can help, and then feel betrayed or abandoned by us when we are under-involved. There's also a safety risk, as we may not hear about their concerns if we're under-involved. But again, I'm guessing that most of us in this space have a harder time with over-involvement than with under-involvement. When we're over-involved, we risk burning ourselves out and losing the energy to feel compassion for our clients and our newcomers that we're working with. We may put our own safety at risk. We may be making decisions for clients instead of with clients. We're taking that power away from them, which can be very harmful when we're working with people who may have had very limited control over their lives in the past few years and are really needing to take that agency for themselves. When we're over-involved, we may also blame ourselves for bad things that happen to the newcomers we're working with, rather than realizing, we can't control everything. We're blaming ourselves. So we can help avoid these risks to ourselves and our clients when we set really clear boundaries. We're saving ourselves time by focusing our energy on what's effective, what we can do. We're able to safeguard our own physical and emotional energy, protect ourselves against burnout, and again, focus on what we can do rather than what we cannot do. And we all want to help the clients we're serving and the newcomers we're supporting. That's why do this work. That's why we engage in these programs. But we are going to be the most helpful to our clients for the most amount of time when we can keep our work in that zone of helpfulness. And we can do that by setting clear boundaries. So we'll talk more about what it looks like to set and keep boundaries. So in setting boundaries, it's very important to make these boundaries clear very early on and make them consistent. By setting boundaries from the get-go of this relationship, of this partnership, this is going to help prevent problems in the future, right? So every sponsor-client relationship is different. So it's very important for there to be a really clear understanding of roles and responsibilities from the beginning. These boundaries should be communicated clearly to set realistic expectations and create trust between the newcomer and the sponsor. And sometimes newcomers have a really hard time differentiating between resettlement agency staff or co-sponsors or volunteers, and they might expect the same of both. And they might be coming to you as a sponsor for things that they should go to their caseworker about if applicable. So again, very early on in this relationship, if you are working with a resettlement agency, it's really essential that you work with the resettlement agency and the newcomer to clarify and confirm roles and responsibilities. Make sure it's really clear who's doing what. It's gonna be helpful for the future. And then once these clear guidelines are set, clarify your role frequently with the client. So maybe using some language like, as your co-sponsor, I can support with this, but I cannot support with this. This person might be able to support with this, but saying I can do this, I cannot do this. So making that really clear and continuously clarifying. Boundaries, you can go to the next slide. So boundaries are absolutely essential for not just you, but also for the client, right? So our newcomers are in survival mode. They've just arrived and there's an incredible amount of need, especially in those first 90 days of arrival. So it's very essential to manage those expectations and make sure that they know where your support starts and where it stops. Clear and mutual understanding of your role is going to reduce potential for any conflict between the two of you and create reduce the risk of any unmet expectations, right? So even professional agents, resettlement agency staff have a difficult time with boundaries, but they're so important for everyone to keep the relationship smooth. It's very, very difficult to undo a problem that has been created by blurred boundaries. A few weeks ago, I was talking to a co-sponsor group from within our network, kind of hearing from them on how their experience went, and they were reflecting on their own boundaries and how they're very open with themselves that, we did not set good boundaries in the beginning. We decided we would just take them everywhere they needed to go. We would take them to work, we would take them to the mosque, we would take them to appointments everywhere, rather than teaching them how to ride the bus, because the easier thing to do was drive them. But as they were reflecting on this, they're at the 6-month mark of their program. They're supposed to be wrapping up, but the family is still very much reliant on them for transportation. And that is because they did not set that boundary early on in saying, we can't take you everywhere. That's not the expectation that was set. Was, well, the co-sponsor will drive you everywhere you need to go. So 6 months later, it's incredibly hard to undo that, right? So just an example of how it can be difficult to undo a problem that's been created by blurred boundaries. So on the next slide, well, don't be afraid to say no. This is probably the golden rule of boundary setting, right? So this is very difficult at first. It's difficult to say no, but it is essential. Is the client, the newcomer, asking you to make a phone call, even when his or her English is sufficient to do it alone? Are they asking you for money or for material goods? Are they asking you for a ride to work or school, or et cetera, et cetera? You, as a co-sponsor, as a community sponsor, you have the right to say no. And if you find yourself doing it repeatedly about the same issues, I really encourage you to connect with your resettlement agency point of contact, or whoever is supporting you, for facilitation with support with facilitating this conversation with the newcomer. Saying no and enforcing this boundary, it will feel uncomfortable in the short term, but we're looking for long-term success. So by saying no 1 month into giving them a ride, that's setting the expectation that they need to take public transportation and navigate this on their own, so that when your 6-month commitment ends, they have the ability to get themselves where they need to go, and they're not relying on you and your group. And ultimately, boundaries, they help prevent burnout, right? So they help you prevent you from getting to that place where you're overwhelmed, you're losing feelings of compassion, you're not, prevents you from getting burnt out. So resettlement work is stressful, even for volunteers who are only engaging with it once or twice a week. It's a very, very high burnout field, lots of turnover. And the primary way to prevent that is to take care of yourself. Don't feel bad if you need to take a week off for a little bit of personal time, if you need to step away from the responsibilities for a few days, and turn it over to somebody else on the team. The best helpers are going to know how to keep a balance between themselves and the people that you're helping. If you start to feel yourself burnt out, again, I encourage you to connect with someone and let someone else know how you're feeling, and try to troubleshoot some ways to solve that. And on the next slide, we'll talk about just detached compassion. I wanted to bring that up. So another tip for keeping boundaries is thinking about this term, detached compassion. This is a concept that's defined as a way of entering into the situation of the person being helped that enables the helper to continue to function effectively in the helping role. So although it is important to form a bond with clients, it's also important to remember that taking on client problems as your own, it might feel like compassion in the moment, but ultimately it removes the power and the agency away from them. And that's important to keep in mind, as your efforts in trying to help can ultimately hurt when we enable and we do for, rather than empower the client to do things on their own. So just a few questions to consider when you're setting up boundaries as a group. So in the very early days, before you've even been matched with a newcomer, you're in the process, you're working with your group, you're getting training set up. Start thinking about these questions. So what contact information are we going to give to the clients? Are the clients going to have all of our phone numbers? Are they only going to contact the team lead? Or are they only going to contact an email account or a WhatsApp line? Which planned times will we visit the client? Is it going to be Monday, Wednesday, Friday from X time to X time? Is it only going to be on the certain days? Or are we going to be flexible with it and do it as an as needed basis? Will we take the family somewhere that might require spending money? And if we are taking them somewhere that requires spending money, who's paying for it? Or are we gonna ask them to pay for things on their own? What spaces will we invite the family into? Are we gonna invite them into our homes? How will we navigate that conversation if maybe they see that our homes have lots of nice, expensive things in it, and it looks maybe a little different from their homes? How will we, as a sponsor team, make sure that the client knows they have the power to consent to activities or services? I think this one is an important one, right? Because when you're in this relationship with a newcomer and you're doing so much for them, they might just feel obligated to say yes to everything that you suggest or at different activities. But how will we, as a co-sponsor team, make sure that the client knows that they have the power to say no to these things? Just like we, as sponsors and resettlement agency staff, we have the power to say no. So do they, and how can we empower that? And then the last is, how is our role as a community sponsored team different than the role of the resettlement agency? So how is it different? And then how are we going to communicate that difference to the family? How are we going to enforce it? How are we going to work with the resettlement agency to make sure that this is continuously being enforced and reiterated? And these are not questions that you need to answer like immediately, or this is not a exhaustive list, but just kind of to get the wheels turning of, start thinking about these things that will come up throughout your sponsorship commitment. And then just a few ways to recognize that there are boundary issues. So maybe your gut says, "Oh no, not again," to a refugee request, but your mouth's fear or sense of urgency says, "One more time can't hurt," right? So in your head, you're thinking, "Oh, I can't do this again," but out loud you say, "Oh, it's fine. One more time won't hurt. I'll drive them this one last time." You find yourself wanting to solve the refugees' feelings of anger, disappointment, or loss. You want to block them from that, and you want to solve that. You want to fix it for them. You want to buffer refugees or newcomers from the very, very real difficulties of starting life over again at the essentially the bottom of a new culture. And that feels harsh to say, but they're coming into the country and with low, maybe not having language abilities or low paying jobs or not a lot of money. That is difficult, and it's not in anyone's best interest to try to avoid them feeling or recognizing them. So that's a boundary issue. You wanting to buffer them from those feelings. Or maybe you're trying to insert yourself as a middleman into the refugees' relationships or disputes. You're jumping in where maybe it's not appropriate. Maybe you don't need to be the middleman in family issues or issues with the employer or any of their other relationships. Maybe you're finding yourself jumping in where maybe it's not appropriate. You realize that you are afraid that the family won't like you or might be angry with you if you don't meet their expectations or if you say no. You're feeling that you're doing things out of a sense of, well, I want them to like me. I don't want them to be annoyed with me or anything like that. You try to force solutions to a problem rather than giving the newcomers the information and the tools needed to solve it for themselves, right? And that's what kind of we were talking about earlier in those examples of being over involved. You're handling all the conversations, you're jumping in, you're providing solutions, but what will they do in 6 months when you're not there, right? How will they get those solutions? So you're jumping in. You start to think that no one can solve a refugee's problems as well as you can. Maybe something comes up and you think, I have to help. I have to help. How could they possibly help without me? There's no way they could. That's a boundary issue. You catch yourself thinking, oh, it feels really good to be needed. Again, it might, but that's a boundary issue. And then lastly, your own family, work, and or relationships are suffering because of time or the emotional attention given to refugees. If in any way other aspects of your life, your job, your family, your other relationships are suffering because of the time, the intensive time and capacity, emotional energy that's needed in this work, that's a boundary issue. So just a few things to keep in mind as ways to recognize when boundaries are being crossed. And so lastly, as things come up and as requests or tasks or questions from the families come up, it's important, it's kind of can be helpful to think about these three questions, right? So ask yourself, what is the goal of resettlement? Is this activity they're asking for help with, is it in line with the goal of resettlement? The goal of resettlement is self-sufficiency. So is this thing that I'm being asked to do, is this contributing to self-sufficiency? If not, maybe that's a boundary issue. Is it for the fundamental well-being of the family? Does this activity support independence? So when these requests come up and you're unsure of whether or not you're crossing a boundary, these three questions are really useful that to kind of go through before making a decision or moving forward. So for example, imagine a client is asking you for a ride to work, even though you've walked the route with them and you know that they know how to get there, it's doable, and you also know that there's a public transportation option. So in this scenario, you can go through this list. Number one, does it meet the resettlement goal of self-sufficiency? Is it for the fundamental well-being of the family? Does giving a ride support independence? So when you're looking at it in the framework of these three questions, it's easier to see, okay, yeah, this might not be the right thing to do, right? These things are not promoting self-sufficiency. This is not promoting independence, but rather giving them a ride is promoting dependence on you. Calling the school for them is promoting dependence on you. Calling their employer to tell them that they can't come to work tomorrow, that's promoting dependence on you. What will they do when you go out of town for a week? Are they going to just miss work? They just won't get there on time? That's not sustainable, right? So it's important to think about the long-term effects of these seemingly small activities. And with that, wrap up a little early so we can pause here for any questions or comments.
Thank you, Hannah. Yes, this time is going to be for your questions. So you're going to have now the ability to unmute yourself. And if I believe right, you're going to also be able to come on camera if you want. So please do put your questions in the chat or unmute and ask your question live.
Yeah. Yeah, or if you don't have any questions, you have comments, you have a story, you have suggestions, maybe something that I missed of how you set boundaries in your space or in your relationship with newcomers. Any comments? Yeah, Carol said, thanks so much for the reminder for self-care. Again, I'm all about self-care, my friends. This is tough work and we got to take care of ourselves. And if we let ourselves, burnout is real. It's tough work, tough problems that our newcomers that we're working with are facing. So we need to be able to take care of ourselves to be able to help others. I think Carol has a question. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just a suggestion too. There are some good references, and I missed the beginning, so maybe you said those, but When Helping Hurts, they've got some really good study guides and things to use with your teams to know, and that's just really good, helpful, kind of foundational things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. That's a great resource. There's so many resources on compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, self-care, burnout in this spaces. So we can definitely include some in the follow-up, but plenty out there. for sure. So thank you, Carol.
This would be also a good time for you guys. If you have any best practices that you felt like it worked very well with you, or even lesson learned. We don't always get everything right. And so what are some lessons or practices that you have seen working well, or things that you have seen to be, oh, I wish I knew that before, or now I know how to do this differently? Please do share with the group.
Yeah, it's hard. It's definitely hard. And it's kind of, I feel like it's so abstract if you haven't worked with a newcomer yet. But then once you get into the relationship, it becomes so quickly to see why we talk about this and why it's so important, because you are doing this because you want to be helpful. And the way to be helpful is by, taking care of yourself, setting boundaries. And that's ultimately going to help them more than it help the other way around, right? So it's a tough one. It's an ongoing need.
And I have Teresa, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and somebody else from another group taught me this. I have the conversation before it starts with at least the leader, but often the team. That's basically, what are we going to do when it happens that you're feeling burned out? And I jumped in late too, so you might have said this, but I just say every team has a moment where one person maybe just gets too enmeshed with the family, or one person gets too upset about the way the agency is doing everything and wants to take over medical or something. And it always happens, and it's hard. But if you avoid it, it gets much worse. So I just say this will happen because you're going to be loving on these people, and let's just talk about that. And I've done that the last 2 or 3 teams, and I've found it to be really helpful because we had something to go back to when a problem arose.
100%. And you're so right. Like, it's important to be proactive with this. And before you even meet with the newcomer for the first time, start thinking about, okay, yeah, what are we going to do when this happens? And it's particularly helpful if you have someone on the team who's maybe done it before or has experience with it, and who can kind of give some anecdotes there. But yeah, absolutely agreed. I see a question in the chat. How do you handle when you have the right balance, but when it's time to end the co-sponsorship and the family just is not able to continue without you because of the fact they're learning a new language and they're not there yet? Yeah, it's a really good question, and a good point that it's true that at the end of 6 months or 3 months or whatever the time period is, they're not self-sufficient. That's going to be true more often than not, right? Like, self-sufficiency is a hard to achieve. I think the important thing to do is really look at being like self-critical of you and your group, and think, okay, well, what are the things that we're most helping with? Is it ESL? Is it transportation? Is it whatever it is? Is it providing in-kind donations and private resources? Let's take a look at these things and make a plan for what will this look like in 3 months? Like, what are some immediate things that we can do to just tweak the way we're working with the family, so that no one's saying, you have to, once the program ends, you have to get out of there and you're never going to see each other again, and the ties are cut entirely. That's not practical, or what anybody really goes into this for. The key would just be taking a look at what you're doing and seeing where we can make some modifications. Where can we be empowering rather than doing for? Maybe, so we're at the IRC, we have a 6-month program, right? So at 3 months, we have a meeting with the co-sponsors, the clients, and the resettlement agency staff member, and we have a self-sufficiency checklist. And we look at this list and we say, okay, the goals are for them to be able to talk to their landlords on their own, or call the schools on their own. And if at 3 months, halfway into the program, we're going through this checklist and we're seeing, okay, we're not there yet for this, and this. And then we make a plan of action to kind of target it specifically. But yeah, exactly. I totally agree that, it's not always going to be so clean cut, but the key will just be finding areas where we can make the slight modifications to be empowering rather than enabling. Any other questions? Crystal asked, can Teresa share examples of plans co-sponsor groups have made? So a question for you, Teresa, if you're able and willing.
For plans they've made.
Just, I think, as you were saying, you've talked about like, what will we do if this happens? Do you have any examples
Oh,
of
okay. Well,
yeah.
I think it just, yeah, I just did one recently where one team member of a team that was no, they're probably 5 months into a 6 month. And we had talked about it before. And so she called about this one team member who just, he's very fatherly, and he just was in a snit because he just thought things weren't getting done enough with medical. And all I did was I pointed back to the fact that we had talked about that, and that, they have that tendency and everyone's looking out for the best wishes. And then I actually sent him a video I send leaders, which is from it's from one of the lunch and learns on, I forget the name of it, but it's like what to do the second half, how you help your family move towards self-sufficiency. And we talked about that. So it's more like it makes a conversation more comfortable when it comes up later if you've already kind of given that leader the grace of, hey, this is going to happen with your team. Someone's going to get upset because not enough is being done or get too enmeshed.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we come back around to that conversation, then I could say, well, and so the steps for this gentleman was, I volunteered to talk to him, but she said she could handle it. And we sent him this video, and I sent him a list on boundaries, and she talked through it with him. And I just think it was she knew that might happen. And when it did, it was less painful, I guess, or less uncomfortable to have those conversations. So just keeping those conversations in the forefront, I think. I have like a weekly check-in or bi-weekly check-in with leaders. And so I find at about the middle part, it seems like when this is about 3-4 months, this starts coming up a little more frequently.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was an example.
That was great. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's even particular, like thinking about so we have co-sponsor, and then we have resettlement agency in a lot of relationships, and then we have the newcomer. And it's sometimes there's maybe a clash between the way the resettlement agency wants to do things or the way the co-sponsor thinks we should do things. So I think open dialogue between the two and like really clear expectations and communication between the resettlement agency and the community sponsor group is really important from the beginning, and kind of hashing these things out before they happen, and making sure the co-sponsors have an understanding of why a resettlement agency wants to do something this way and vice versa. So lots of communication there.
One other thing I have been noticing lately with the last two teams is I've had to come in and at the midpoint and remind people that, at 3 or 4 months in, they should be having friends in their own community. And if you are doing so much for them or not making that a priority, then they are going to call you more, that they need to start finding their own friends and maybe workmates that they can get rides from and things, because I think it tends to be a lot of this until someone gets a car. And I think that's been kind of eye-opening to this one team in particular, and they realized that they really hadn't helped them seek out maybe a Facebook group or how to find other folks. They didn't have a US tie, so they needed to be more involved in the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I was actually just thinking more about Michelle's question from, she asked, how do you handle it when it's just it's not possible to end the co-sponsorship because they can't continue without you. I was just thinking, well, most refugee newcomers don't have a co-sponsor group. Most are just coming through the resettlement agency and getting the services there, right? So what are these clients doing at the end of the 90 days? How would a client without a co-sponsor navigate these things that you're still helping the family with, right? But what would they do? What do all the other clients do in the situations, and thinking about it from that perspective? Because there are many other clients who are doing this without the support of a group, and they're doing it, right? So how can we model that a little bit? Great comments and questions, everyone. Any other questions, other comments, other stories or best practices or resources that have worked well for you all? or any resources that you need that would help you in setting better, anything that we can do. Lindsay, go ahead.
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for facilitating this conversation. I think a big a best practice too is like keeping in mind like the restraints that we all have. And I think it's like we all want, the co-sponsors, the resettlement agency often even like wants to be able to do stuff like wants to be able to go above and beyond, but we like cannot. And I think always keeping that in mind of like we work within the government, and as much as we want to do all this stuff and keeping that in mind, and we have new families all the time, and how can we like do the most like and be efficient. What I think all the time too is I work in I think like a community that is newer to resettlement, and that is the big problem. We have to keep in mind that our job is to connect people to the resources in the community, and often it's like I think the best thing we can do is be advocates. And I think it's like, what's difficult is that you say, you want the families to be able to make their own appointments, but if you're working within a school system that doesn't have a very well-funded ESOL program, there's just so many barriers, and your heart goes out to that. And it's like, well, how can they? And I think it's not you taking on, and it's hard not to take it on for that family, but trying to advocate for refugees in general. Like, how can we advocate? And I think that's where I try to push a lot of like frustration that volunteers that we all get, like, how can we make a big difference overall? Can I like go to the school board meeting? Can we advocate on that to get more resources so that the systems themselves can do these jobs? We want to do it, but I think there's like that is like the ultimate solution. And but it's so that it's a long-term thing too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to think about like when you're thinking about challenges or whatever the newcomer is facing. It's like, is this something that I have control over? Is this something that the resettlement agency actually even has control over? Because the chances are it's not. It's usually the resettlement agencies are working in the same systems that you are trying to work through as well. There's not a lot of control over certain things like benefits or documentation. That's all comes from above. So thinking about, well, what can we control, or what can we maybe control less, but there's areas for advocacy and stuff like that versus trying to fix it. So really good point. Thanks for bringing that up, Lindsay. Any other comments, questions, anything? I'd be happy to give people back some time if not, but any other comments, happy to take them.
I just have a comment. I did drop the link for all of our past Lunch and Learn webinars. So if you go to the chat, you will find it there. This is where Teresa was mentioning one of the webinars. So please feel free to use it and share it with your groups. And Hannah, I think that would be a good point to conclude our webinar. So we would love to hear from you and receive any feedback on today's webinar and hear your suggestion for future Lunch and Learn topics. So if you can take just one moment with us right now to either scan the QR code on the screen or follow the link in the chat to leave us a feedback. This is where I go back and I see your suggestions. I see how we're doing with the webinars. I see other topics that you're interested in, and we are able to provide quality webinars and topics to you. So please do share with us your feedback so we can follow up with that and take your interest into consideration. And on that, Hannah, thank you so much for leading today's presentation. And we thank everyone who joined us today. And we hope that you have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much, Joy. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening and engaging. And just thank you for all the work you're doing in your communities as well. It's really incredible. Have a great rest of your week, everyone.